We have Rob Henderson here. You know him, you love him. Self-titled Substack, brilliant on topics of self-improvement and the mind and class and society. Has a wonderful new book coming out, and there's a little bit of controversy attached to it, and we're going to talk about that whole rigmarole. But what were we discussing? What were we saying, Rob? I had thoughts. I was pinging around.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a big topic right now, the danger of sharing your life online. That's hot right now.
Yes. Yeah, I know that there was some controversy. Was it Mark Zuckerberg who posted a photo of himself online with his kids, and he put the little emojis over their faces? And some media outlets picked it up saying, oh, this man who wants all of us to put our lives on the line won't actually show the faces of his own children. Ryan Holiday wrote a very nice post in the Free Press about, his own struggles with this, of, how much of his family to put online versus not. And he has a pretty big platform. And yeah, I understand it. I mean, I think we're learning as we go, right? I think as of maybe 10 years ago, it was very common to see people post Facebook photos of their babies and their children, and people would, update their default photo of their newborn. And this was very common behavior. And I think now people are having second thoughts about this, but it seems to be more so among like the sort of upper middle class, the chattering class, that are really concerned about privacy for their kids. I don't really see that conversation happening elsewhere.
Yeah, it might not be as big a problem elsewhere. It might be a bigger problem if you're in the chattering class, because your kid or yourself might become somebody with more of a public profile.
Right.
So it's a big deal. And for those who do not know, we were having a conversation about my various parenting tactics, and I immediately got this impulse, in part because I had Eric Schwartzel of the Wall Street Journal on to talk about the life and death of Dave Hollis, who became this sort of family self-help guru following the lead of his wife, who wrote a hit book called Girl Wash Your Face. And he was ultimately consumed by the project of showing his life to the world. I think I've posited that, you can tell that The Truman Show is a very 1990s movie, because when this guy finds out his life is being broadcast to the world, he is horrified and he is trying to get away from it. If The Truman Show was made today, when Truman discovered this, he would start to get addicted to, well, what's the audience think? Oh, should I do this? What if I kiss my wife like this? What if I kiss her like this? Does this go a little better? I think that would be the sequel to it, that people would approach it with trepidation before becoming ensnared in the addictive performance of one's life that ultimately consumes you.
The audience capture, maybe that movie is due for an upgrade, that once you discover there's an audience watching, that it becomes about, well, how do we monetize this? Or how do we, what does the audience think? Are there ways to upvote or downvote every action and every behavior? And so maybe, at the beginning of the movie, he starts out as just a regular average Joe, and then by the end, he's completely transformed based on audience incentives. That would be really interesting to see, actually.
He's talking like a YouTuber, looking at the camera, saying, "Hey guys," just whenever he says anything.
I see this with TikTok. So I'm not on TikTok. I don't really, but every once in a while, someone will post a TikTok on Twitter/X or on Instagram, and I'll see these videos. And it seems like not only does TikTok reward that sort of weird uptalk, sing-songy voice, but also the hand gestures. I'm seeing a lot of the hand gestures like this on TikTok, and I'm wondering, does the algorithm pick that up? Do they like that sort of body motion? Do they sense those gestures, and the algorithm boosts it? I don't understand that, because it looks very strange to me. All of TikTok is strange to me. I refuse to get on it.
Well, it means that the social media platforms are biased towards Italians, which I say tongue in cheek.
Right.
But that format where people say, we're blank, and, they give little, it became this sort of weird format of people talking about their community. It pissed people off, where people, double income, no kids, they were saying, we're dinks. And they sort of are trolling those of us with children. We're dinks. We don't have to do this. We have sex, whatever. I saw one with we're Italians, with a bunch of social media stars, especially in the food realm. And they actually, one of them did make reference to the hand gestures. And I think she did anyway. But I thought, wow, Italians are punching above their weight on social media in a way that I haven't seen before.
Right.
So to what you're saying, if gesticulation is an advantage, then that would clearly advantage the Italian. And it's a good little teaser, because we're going to talk about Rob being pre-canceled, and then we're going to talk later about the Sopranos. That's the general shape of this. So maybe a little, you know, a little Italian connection to bring it full circle. Rob, have you been pre-canceled in the way that one can pre-order a book? Your fantastic book, Troubled, which I have read and we have discussed. You want to do a book tour. You want to go to bookstores, and you have written a post on Substack called "Bookstores Refuse to Host an Event for My Book. I'm an Unwelcome Author." What's going on, man? What's up? Why aren't you allowed in a bookstore? A fairly placid place.
Zero interest from any bookstore. So I've been, a few months ago, I had this conversation with my agent, with my publishers, publicist and editor, and basically everyone over at Simon & Schuster. And, you know, everyone seems to be very interested in the idea of a book tour. And we thought we would start small, start with the big cities, start where, you know, I have and you can access, you know, you're familiar with the sort of the analytics on Substack. You can sort of see where your audience is. And unsurprisingly, a lot of my readers are concentrated in New York and California, and especially the Bay Area. And so I figured, okay, let's start with New York and San Francisco and sort of gauge interest and go from there, then maybe branch out to Austin or Miami and so on. And so my publicist contacted, you know, a large number of big bookstores in New York and SF, and got zero interest across the board. Some just outright declined, others ignored her, and she chased up, and they continued to ignore, and others did get back and say they were uninterested. And this was surprising to me. I've hosted sort of informal meetups for my Substack readers and Twitter followers in the past, and I've had upwards of 40 or 50 people show up, and these are just informal. You know, I'm at a bar and I'll just say, hey, I'll be at X bar, you know, wherever in Miami next week. If you want to come hang out, post that on Substack, post it on Twitter, and usually draw a pretty large crowd. So I figured for something more formal, like a book event, I could draw a much larger crowd. And these bookstores were interested. I looked at their websites to see what their events page looked like, who they were inviting to deliver book talks at their stores. And these were people with, I mean, some of these people had almost no online footprint whatsoever. Some of these people had maybe 1,000 or 2,000 Twitter followers. Some of them had maybe a perch at some legacy media outlet. But I didn't see a single author, you know, just to be very blunt, I didn't see a single author that had the same online profile as me. And it's a weird thing, right? Because if you're, you know, so I have the same imprint at Simon & Schuster as Britney Spears. Britney Spears isn't going to do she's not going to talk at a bookstore, right? And so I figured like the bookstore would be like the sort of perfect place for someone like me, sort of like a medium-sized online writer person, maybe draw, you know, 50, 100, maybe 150 as an upper bound, which is like a pretty good size crowd for a big bookstore. Whereas some of these people, I'd be honestly surprised if they grow more than 20 people tops. And so this was confusing to me. And I outlined this in that Substack post that, you know, at least on paper, I have the kinds of things that cultural elites tend to like. You know, I have the credentials, the education credentials. I have this unique story. The imprint that I published with isn't even the conservative imprint at Simon & Schuster. It's their mainstream imprint. You know, they've published Amy Schumer and Britney Spears and Mike Rowe and just all, you know, sort of celebrities and middle of the road people. None of them are like, you know, known public right-wing figures. And yet, you know, I asked around, I asked other authors, other people in the publishing industry, and, you know, they may have read the synopsis of my book and considered it to be, you know, not politically progressive, or they may have seen some of the people who endorsed my book, people like Jordan Peterson or J.D. Vance.
That's more your problem. Your book is not. Your book is not political.
Right. It's not political at all. And yet, I also received blurbs from people on the left side of the political spectrum as well. Well, people like Thomas Chatterton Williams and Melissa Carney, and so it was kind of a shock to me at first. But the more I thought about it, sadly, the more it seemed to make sense, and the more I spoke with other authors, the more the puzzle pieces seemed to fit together.
Yeah, and I think we can just dispel the idea that this is a reaction to the level of demand. As you have written, you have 136,000 followers on Twitter. We can say Twitter's not real life, but damn, do these publishers care about that kind of thing. I know when I wrote a book, they wanted me to talk about how many Twitter followers I have. They do see it as a proxy for popularity, and that's quite a bit for an author. And as you said, you've been featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Boston Globe. So this is deliberate. It's a deliberate freeze out. The question is why. And in your article about it, you have a bit of a class-based analysis that you are not of this sort of author community in good standing. You come out of foster care. And so there's a little bit of perhaps, even if this cohort would act as though they are sympathetic to such people, in reality, they are not. I think there might be something to that, but I think something else is going on here where I'm not sure it's the elites who are really trying to freeze you out. If I had to guess, and you know more about the nuts and bolts here, I would guess that it's people who work in these bookstores. That's what I would guess. And these people are not, by and large, elites. I don't think that your enemy is the suits. I would guess that your enemy is the shirts. I don't think your enemy is an upper class, older executive. I think it's a Gen Z woman who works at a bookstore, maybe with purple hair. I'm just stereotyping. I'm just throwing out a random example. And they probably have some say-so. They might say something. It would ruffle feathers, given that you have talked to certain people who are regarded as disreputable within that community. What do you think of that? That this is more a middle out revolution or issue than it is top down?
Yeah, I mean, I think those, that's not an unfair critique, and there's something to that idea. But I would just, as a response, my sense is that if I were able to communicate more, and I took the stance more of the sort of took the line of the typical elite in my book, in my associations, in the way that I communicate the concerns that I have coming out of where I came from, these people would be more open to it. So they themselves, I don't know if do I use the term? I might have used the term.
I agree, which is why I want to have this conversation. I think it's a fascinating instance where the luxury beliefs are clung to most tightly by those who are not in the upper classes. They might filter down from the upper classes, but there's this other kind of art school cohort.
Aspirational elites. That's like a term. Peter Turchin has kind of reintroduced that in the last couple of years. Aspirational elites, where they've chosen to work in culture rather than to make money. They're sort of in these spaces where they can act as gatekeepers. A lot of them probably would like to be editors at some glossy magazine or at a prominent newspaper, and they work at a bookstore. And these bookstores, I mean, these are like the fashionable, trendy bookstores in New York and SF. And so it would make sense that they would have some of these luxury beliefs. They would have some of these, these cultural stances, and read someone like me or see my associations and freeze me out. And so it's not I don't think it's like a direct, like, I guess I could have been more clear about this in the piece that, this person was in foster care, therefore I'm not going to allow him here. No. It was more so, I was in foster care and I'm honest about the steps required to remake one's fortunes and to exit that situation, and give a very sort of blunt analysis of what's happening with sort of decaying families and deteriorating communities across the country from that perspective, without pledging fealty to the reasons that elites would like me to give, systemic forces or oppression or luck or privilege or those things. I mean, I do cite some of those things in the book, but for the most part, I do place a greater emphasis on personal agency and responsibility, and to some degree, the abdication of responsibility by people, members of the elite or aspirational elites. I mean, in a weird way, this does confirm some of my criticisms within the book that, if I were to speak at one of these stores and communicate these ideas, then more people would understand or perhaps open their minds to some of the difficulties and struggles of sideline kids and struggling communities. But they don't want me to speak. They don't want me to communicate these ideas. And so it's a bit of both, I think. I mean, it's a bit of a class-based response, but politics enters in here, but those things are overlap so tightly now that it's really hard to disentangle. And I do think that if I were to make the same argument, but I did actually come from a more well-to-do background, I'm actually not entirely sure that the response would have been the same. So, holding the arguments constant, but I'm just, some waspy guy who went to these schools and published in the same outlets, articles in the New York Times or whatever. I do wonder if they would receive me differently, to some degree. Let's
rebrand it. It will be some sort of cutesy kind of, a little bit of vulgarity title, like "Own Your Shit." And the I is some sort of, symbol to not make it a real curse word. And your associations change. You're getting interviewed by Scott Galloway and people who are more acceptable. And it becomes about the whole self, the true self. You throw in a little bit more introspection to the entire thing. Say therapy helped get you to this place of knowing you have to own
more men
your
need
shit.
Therapy.
Yes,
which I guess we're going to get into later.
We're going to get into that.
That point that you made about having some kind of vulgar word in the title, but then having an exclamation or something to freeze. So I posted this article on Twitter. This is all behind a paywall, right, Ethan? This is
it's up to you. I leave it to the guest. Whatever you want.
Okay, well, if there's a question mark over that, I'll just say, and the clever listeners will be able to figure out what I'm getting at here. So I posted this thing on Twitter, this article, bookstores refuse to host my book event, and someone commented, someone who has sold millions of books with that exact kind of style of very vulgar word, but and has done very well for himself. And he said, "Oh, this is an economic. There's a very, obviously this is an economic issue. These bookstores cater to, middle-aged women, and your followers aren't that. I strongly doubt that the people who follow you are going to be the kinds of people who go to bookstores. And in a weird way, it was a sort of an elitist attitude.
Yeah.
But I think he's wrong on both counts. I mean, the people who read me are the kind of people who do go to bookstores. I mean, I've ran polls and surveys and stuff, and like the people who read my stuff tend to be like highly educated and well off. These are the sort of what is like Peter Turchin likes to use this term counter elites, or sort of counter elite curious. And also the other point about middle-aged women go to bookstores, but they probably don't read your work. And that's also wrong. A lot of middle-aged women read my work. I think there are a lot of middle-aged women who have sons and who are worried about what's happening with young men. And, they are also, curious about reading the struggles of someone who's, relatively young and communicating what's going on with young men in the country too. And so, I think, someone like that, right? It's exactly the kind of person you're describing. It is kind of in your face. It's vulgar. It does talk about masculinity and men's issues. But it's from someone who's within that circle of people, who's more acceptable, from the same kind of background, who runs in the same kinds of circles. Whereas me, I came into the publishing world as a complete outsider, as someone who's very unfamiliar with the entire process.
Oh, I mean, the aforementioned Scott Galloway, who I think is an excellent TV panel performer and podcast performer, has talked from more of a liberal side that, hey, we got an issue with men. There needs to be a positive masculinity. When I see something like that, I feel a wave of relief, actually, because it's okay. Well, some people are going to hear this who need to hear this, who aren't normally hearing about this. But there are definitely ways that you can say some of what you're saying within good standing. But I do think that your general approach is subversive. You are something of a Horatio Alger story of coming from the bottom and building yourself up through hard work and dedication and personal responsibility. These are personal choices by definition, and yet they seem to be something with a political valence, right? Mm-hmm. Because people who want to indict society for creating such conditions are worried that the message of personal responsibility will negate that indictment. Yeah. Which I think is childish, because both things can exist. You can say that society is creating bad conditions that need to be ameliorated, and also recognize that the only thing one can do as an individual is to try to better themselves. I mean, that's obvious to me. I mean, the idea that, the message would be to anybody who is in an unfair circumstance is that you almost counterintuitively need to act as though it's a fair circumstance. That's your only shot. If you're in an unfair situation with the odds stacked against you, you have a chance. If you say, if I work hard, I can work my way out of this. Like, you have a shot. If you say, no, I've been wronged, this is unfair, which might be true, there's just no shot. There's no way. And so the message that you're giving, I think, is a necessary message. It's the only message that somebody should get. Not the only, but you know what I'm saying. It's the key message somebody should get if they're in a difficult circumstance. But that message seems to rankle people because they're worried that it will negate the other messages that they think are more important on a macro level, that then become a pretext for whatever political program they want.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there are probably two reasons. So one is the one you just described, that for one of the prescriptions that I offer in the book for someone who's in very unpromising circumstances is that, look, no one's coming to save you. Maybe if you're very young, if you're a kid or you're a teenager, a bunch of adults have probably let you down, but they're not going to fix it. Like, only you're going to be able to fix it. And the second point is that the solutions I offer more broadly at a social level, I'd imagine a lot of the people who run, sort of fancy independent bookstores or, work as cultural gatekeepers, they focus a lot on material poverty, on economic inequality, and those things. I don't discount those things, but I do think that we pay a little too much attention to them. And one of the other prescriptions I offer in my book, in terms of society, in terms of people who wield economic and cultural and social influence, is the issue of family deterioration, of how, I didn't want this book necessarily to just be that kind of the bootstrap story of someone who was born into tough circumstances but worked his way out of it. I mean, it is that a little bit, but I also spend quite a bit of time on the experiences of my friends growing up and how their lives turned out. And that's like the sort of modal outcome, right? Like, my life was much more likely to look like theirs than how it looks like right now. And so I wanted to spotlight some of their stories and how, I had friends who ended up in prison, or one friend who was shot to death, and other friends who were just kind of working menial jobs, or maybe have kids with multiple different partners that they no longer speak to, and what their lives look like, and what led to those situations, and how none of us were raised in a stable, intact family. None of us, had supervision or any real oversight when we were growing up to learn good habits and self-discipline and focus. I tell one story in the book about a good friend of mine who could have gotten a football scholarship. All he had to do was take this 2-week makeup course, and he just didn't go, and his parents weren't really that involved in his life, and his life went in a different direction, and now he works at a gas station. That's how much I think family influence can change someone's life. The difference between going off to college or versus having two different kids with two different women and working for minimum wage and, just living a very bleak life. And so I think both of those two things, the prescriptions for the self and the prescriptions for society at large, these are just two, and I also wonder to some extent, I mean, these people probably didn't read the chapters in the book. They probably just read the description at most. But, I am very honest with what conversations and attitudes were like during that period in the late 90s and the early 2000s. I use the slurs that were common at that time and the ways that we talked about people who, today we would be embarrassed or ashamed to use some of these terms. But at that point in those communities, 20 years ago, this was very typical. And I think that if they saw that too, they would also be infuriated. A lot of this stuff, I didn't want it to be sanitized. And I read memoirs by people who are the same age as me, or I read personal essays of people reflecting back on their time during this period in the mid 2000s. And I know that there are parts of that they're leaving out. Even I had to leave some things out. It could have been much uglier, but I think that's also something that plays a role.
They might not even know it. Years ago, I stumbled upon some of my AIM messages with friends from, God, it might have been kind of the mid-aughts. And just some of my friends, I couldn't even believe some of the stuff they were putting in there. I mean, stuff that I wouldn't even see in group chats now that feel more secure than the general online world. And I don't think that they remember talking like that back then, which is one of the reasons why I'm so against this idea of making people being held to the past as though it's the present, as though we live all in one time. I think that's just completely insane. But maybe they were offended by that. I think it's more the associations. I think it's that you'll do a podcast with a Jordan Peterson. You'll do a podcast with a Richard Hanania. Peterson seems to stick. Andrew Bogut used to be the center for the Golden State Warriors, and he was interested in Jordan Peterson when he was becoming a thing, and he was really blowing up and going on that tour a few years ago. And I did a podcast where I went with Bogut to this Peterson talk because I'm a curious person. And it's interesting. I mean, we're in downtown Los Angeles, and there's this big buzz around this self-help guru from Canada who's politically controversial. And I wanted to know, okay, what's the scene going to be like? Something that people are really interested in. I mean, we went to that debate on the sexual revolution, and it struck me that there was a lot of curiosity about who was there and descriptions of who was there. And it was so interesting I've never had any sort of position on Peterson. I was frankly a little bit bored by the event, but it was interesting to see who was there, how apolitical the event was, save for Dave Rubin being the intro guy. And he was trying to make political jokes, and he wasn't getting laughs out of the crowd. I think they just didn't. It was funny. It was this sort of misalignment between the extremely online and people who had come to 12 Rules for Life for these other reasons and didn't even know that there was a political component to it. So when Dave Rubin is making references to green frogs and telling the audience that you're green frogs, there's just blank expressions. They didn't understand. So this was all very interesting. And I think I did a podcast years ago on it. And that to a certain cohort is stuck to me. That's sticky. I'm some sort of Jordan Peterson fanboy or something.
Oh,
he seems very controversial to a certain cohort. So if I had to guess, it's the Peterson thing. And I mean, what do you make of that? Do you feel like you have to be, I doubt that you regret having those talks with Peterson or Hanania or anybody else who is controversial, but do you feel like you've got to manage your image in such a way just a little bit, or you just don't care at all?
I mean, there are people who I wouldn't speak with, but I mean, Jordan and Richard are far from that threshold. I mean, I'm still, in all likelihood, I'll probably end up talking to Jordan again about my book. He's read it, and yeah, he had nice things to say about it. And yeah, I mean, I did a series of lectures for his new online education venture that he's launching later this year. So we recorded some lectures out in Miami for that. And so, yeah, I just, I know Jordan is polarizing and people have very, people have thoughts about him, strong opinions, and that's fine. But, for the most part, I've gotten a lot of value from some of his work, not all of it, but some of it. And think that, on balance, he's definitely a sort of force for good in the culture. He's done a lot to help young men, and I've seen it personally. And so, yeah, I mean, I think those things definitely probably, let me think here. The only times that people have ever sort of sent me angry emails, at least that I can remember, have been because of my associations with those two people in particular. Yeah. I can't really think of any other.
Yeah, it's that.
I mean, I know that like for some people, JD Vance has become a bit of a polarizing figure since he got into politics, but no one's ever said like, how could you associate with him? It's really more about Richard and more about Jordan, which is actually that is funny. Because I guess for me, I have been, I try not to be overtly political in my work. My book itself doesn't contain any reference to politics. It doesn't contain any reference to Democrats or Republicans or so on. I didn't really grow up with it. I mean, it's funny. Like this is in itself, I think, like a very strong interest in politics in itself is a bit of a class signifier. For the most part, and this is my personal experience, but it's also been borne out in sort of sociological research and ethnographic data that, if you sit around a dinner table at a sort of lower middle class or working class family, politics usually doesn't come up that often for a variety of reasons, financial. I mean, a lot of these families just can't afford cable, so they're not watching, they're not watching The Daily Show. They're not watching, whatever cable show on CNN or Fox. And it's just not really, I think part of sort of entry into the upper middle class is, you have to signal that you're informed, that you're sophisticated, that you're worldly, that you care about events, and that you have to be able to sort of converse fluently about the issues of the day. And that's something that I had no understanding of whatsoever until I got to college. And suddenly it's like, I was at the library at Yale and it's just a stack of New York Times for free and, student discounts for the Wall Street Journal. And everywhere you turn, it's just like everyone wants you to sort of consume prestige media.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely an aspect of politics as knowing which salad fork to choose from in a class situation. I've been fascinated by the quarterback Aaron Rodgers, who was solidly within good standing in PMC culture, whatever you want to call it. People are talking about how he should be the next host of Jeopardy. But he took a very strong anti-vax position and is still taking it and still, or anti-COVID vax, I should specify, and really is quite angry at Anthony Fauci. And I was thinking to myself, it's so subtle how you need to be in these circumstances in an upper middle class situation. Because I was thinking to myself, because I have this internal alarm when somebody is creating or committing kind of a class no-no. And when he in 2024 or 2023 is talking about Fauci, I think, that's not going to go over well. But then I thought to myself, it also doesn't go over well the other way. If I'm at a dinner party, for instance, and I was talking about, I love Fauci, I love him, that would also be weird. So you need to have this sort of subtlety where you know that talking about how much you hate Anthony Fauci would get people uncomfortable and be weird, but also talking about how much you love him would also be weird. And so you just need to know that this is a guy that we don't talk about for whatever reason that we could analyze. And there are so many things like that where it's difficult. It's difficult. You have to be like swimming in the information soup to be able to manage these things and navigate these things.
I saw something almost exactly like this when I was in undergrad, where somehow we were all, it was for the student newspaper. I had written some op-ed for the student, but I was just sitting there, and there was this other student. I didn't know exactly his background. I knew he was a first generation college student, but I don't know sort of exactly. But then somehow the topic of diversity came up. And so like you're saying, so if someone were to sit in that environment at the student newspaper at Yale and say, I hate diversity, you would be, that would be an extremely transgressive thing to say. But what he said was the opposite, where he said, I really love diversity, and diversity is so important to me. And it was too pronounced. It was too cringe, where people were kind of like, okay, like that's fine, but also weird that you're so over the top gushing about diversity. And I picked up on that. That was my second or third year, so I was able to sort of subtly detect this in a way that I wouldn't have when I first arrived on campus. And so, that's an interesting point there, that you have to, sort of show your support, but in a very subtle, nuanced, sort of like a wink and a nod. We know if this is, we all agree on this. We don't have to,
you have to, in 2015, you have to know that it's really cool to say, I love Hamilton. I think Hamilton's amazing. And then 2 years later, like, oh, you like Hamilton? Ooh.
There's some questions about that. Or it has its merits, and you have to it constantly evolves. I just posted this thing on Twitter about how the reasons we are supposed to hate Elon right now are the same reasons we were supposed to hate Zuckerberg 6 years ago. And it reminded me of, so this was right after I arrived at Cambridge. I was hanging out with this other group, this group of us PhD students. And two of them, these two guys were like, oh, let's go see this new Liam Neeson movie. I don't remember which one it was. This was like late 2018. And one of them, these were all Americans. And one of them was like, oh, I think he's racist now. And then the other one was like, oh, no, I read something in the New York Times about how, like, I think we forgave him. Like, I think he's okay now. The other one was like, oh, let me check on that. And he pulls out his phone and he literally looks up, like, I don't know what he Googled. Did we forgive Liam Neeson? But he saw, like, there was some article that exonerated him, that, like, like for a moment he was a bad guy and he did get some hit pieces, but then somehow it blew over, and I think he issued a public apology and it kind of passed. And it was this weird, like, we don't know what to think about him until we look up, what does the media say? What are we supposed to think about this? God. And I'm just sitting there, quite, very amused by this. So like, okay, we have to, good thing we have these phones.
I mean, it's just, we're creating such a multi-layered etiquette society on the level of Japan. It actually, what you're describing reminds me of the way my father described living in Japan. I think he was there back in the 1970s, where he literally gave an example of going to see a movie and how everything needed to be indirect. And it was, I wish I could just come up with two fake movies, or it's just two fake movies. Okay, one movie is called Own Your Shit, and the other movie is called Don't Own Your Shit. That's what we're going with right now. Where one guy goes, I hear Own Your Shit is playing, and the other guy goes, oh, that's interesting. I hear that Don't Own Your Shit is playing. And it's this back and forth dance before a decision is arrived at, that my father was describing as an American that was just maddeningly indirect. And the idea that it's gotten to this oblique territory in America by these completely other means, I find to be just, it's interesting. It's also so stupid. You should just see Liam Neeson. Well, you should see Liam Neeson as well, but you should see Liam Neeson beat up some people, because it's fun to see him beat up some people without regard to whether we've forgiven him or not.
I need to know. I need to know whether the media forgave him. That's the only way I can pay $11 to see his movie. By that point, I was like, oh, like, this makes so much sense. Every action you take, every piece of art you consume, the opinions you hold, it's, got to double check, got to read the room.
That's not reading the room. When you do something without knowing, you've got to, this is why Mimetic has become such a big term on this podcast, is that so much of it is just an awareness of what other people are doing and mirroring them. And so you don't even get to the core of what people are even angry about. You'll have a situation, Jordan Peterson, for instance, and, to be clear, Peterson, I think, sometimes does himself no favors. He'll lash out on Twitter. He'll get very angry at his enemies. All that could be highlighted as, I don't like this guy because blank, but often these people who hate him and know they're supposed to hate him, if you wanted to know who the smallest Russian nesting doll was at the core of it all, they wouldn't be able to tell you. If you said, well, what did he say that you did not like? What was it? I could personally come up with an example or two, but often the person who is very vocal in their anger, they can't. I mean, I had this experience I've talked about on the podcast where I was at an engagement party in Berkeley, and it was Berkeley teachers. It was that sort of scene, that sort of milieu. And one of the women there, I don't even know how it came up. Oh, it was because kids in Memorial Glade on the Cal campus were playing Quidditch or something. And she was sneering about it, which is fair. I support her sneering about that. But then she said it was because she hates J.K. Rowling. And then, and I said, why? And she said, well, you know, she's a transphobe and a homophobe. And I go, okay, well, what did she say? And it's this uncomfortable pause. It's this uncomfortable pause. And then this woman starts to take out her phone to look it up. And I just go, no. This isn't a take-home test. This isn't a take-home test. You need it. You're very angry. You know, you're palpably angry at this woman. And you appear to not really know why. Like you don't actually have, this is something that has never existed in, or maybe if it has, not to this level, not to this degree. Often when people were angry at a public figure, it's because they did blank or they said blank. And maybe they were taken out of context when they said blank, but the quote itself would be something that was known. You know, John Rocker was a relief pitcher who made these comments about the people on the 7 train going to Mets games. And the quotes ran across Sports Center, and he was sort of 1990s canceled for it. But they were his quotes, and people remembered what he was saying. Now it's just this kind of miasma of, I have heard you're bad. People said you're bad. I know to hate you. That's what we got going on right now.
Yeah, I pulled up the headline in whatever, magazine or outlet, and and that's enough for people. And that's so interesting. Yeah, you're right. That you can't really reproduce a direct quote for any of these people. You just have this vague sense that they're bad. And then once you have, I mean, it's a really interesting thing because once the headlines are out that, you know, Jordan Peterson is a misogynist or something, everything that you actually do hear from him, if someone posts a clip, you interpret it through that lens. And so even if he's saying something that is empirically true based on his area of expertise in psychology, you receive that as, oh, well, I read this headline that he's a misogynist, and now he's saying whatever, there are differences between men and women, and now he's justifying his misogyny, right? Everything after that becomes, you know, whatever headline you read. And that is an interesting point there. I mean, it's hard though. Like, you know, I know Jordan does. He doesn't do any favors for himself the way he posts. I mean, there are a lot of really smart people that are just better in long form than they are on Twitter. Nassim Taleb is like this too, famously. You know, there are plenty of people like this.
Well, this is why I always say that I prefer to look at people as a buffet rather than a reservoir, and it bothers me that it's become so common to view public figures as a reservoir, where if one thing is tainted, then the entire supply is tainted. We can't take anything from it. Why can't we just look at people as, oh, I like this aspect. I have use for this aspect. This is something that is useful to me and enjoyable to me. Oh, this aspect right here, I don't really like that aspect. I don't like when there are black olives in the salad. You know, I don't really need that kind of salad. We'll go with something else. I don't know. What sort of buffet are we at? Maybe some gulab jamun. Maybe we're at an Indian buffet. I mean, look, you can take what you want. And to me, that's just so, that's a more sane approach where we all benefit, but it has become common instead to become obsessed with stigmatizing the whole based on very little, often erroneously. And I mean, do you think it's getting better? I mean, that's a question.
Yeah.
Do you think it's getting better? Mr.
Maybe
victim of it right now.
I know. You know, I never use the term canceled, but people are using it. And I'm like, that's just where we are now. These things happen. It is hard for people, I think, to decouple. Even very smart people. I have very smart friends who otherwise are, very, very careful thinkers, very reflective. But, they'll ask me, like, how can you associate with that person? And I'm talking about people on the right, people who are, broadly conservative in orientation, and they see me speaking or interacting with someone also on the political right, and they'll get mad at me for that, just because that one person, that person said one thing, or has a stance on something that they disagree with or what have you. And I'm like, smart people have like an eclectic variety of views, and you can take something from them and discard the others. Like earlier today, I was listening to a podcast by a very far left writer, author, and he has interesting things to say about publishing. And of course, there's like the obligatory "I hate Elon Musk" and all this political stuff too. And I just get past it and listen to what he has to say about the craft of writing and the business of writing. And it's interesting to me. And like, I don't have to hate him. I don't understand why people are unable to do that. But is it? I mean, there are different ways to look at the cancel culture phenomenon. Some people say that it's getting better. It probably is on some level, but others I've heard suggest that the reason it seems to be getting better is because like basically everyone's been canceled already. All of the cancelable people have been canceled.
I don't buy that. I don't buy that. I just think I think Musk is part of it. I think he took over the keep that powered a lot of cancellation. And so there's just less of a mimetic fire hose to cancel people for violating the mores of one particular culture. And then there's just fatigue with it all, exhaustion. There's a political component. Trump being back in the fold in a new election might bring it back. I've seen that theorized that it might be on the way again. I mean, that's how I interpreted some of the recent hubbub about, is Substack hosting Nazis? Obviously, yes. Everybody can see that. But I almost interpreted it as, election season's coming back. This is a symptom of election season.
Interesting.
So we shall.
It may depend. It may depend on the career field as well. I think like you're right that you're not going to get canceled. I mean, broadly, on say like the political right, you probably aren't going to get canceled on social media or something like that, on Twitter or X. But in the universities, cancel culture is actually kind of winding down. And I think that so the point that the reason why cancel culture is winding down in the universities is because they already got rid of all the bad people. There is something to that. I mean, it's still happening. I mean, it doesn't get as much attention in the media anymore. I think maybe because, readers are weary of it, but the academics haven't slowed down. They still have plenty of zest and energy to find pariahs and vilify them over, minute transgressions. And that's one reason why I decided not to pursue that path, but I'm seeing it. So yeah, I think it maybe in prestige media too. I mean, some of these places are hiring more, I guess, like heterodox people, but I don't know. I think in media in the university system, there's something to the idea that they did cancel a lot of people, and that's why cancel culture's fading. But then, in terms of reputational cancellation, I think we're building a bit of an immunity to that.
Yeah. I feel like I'm Schrodinger's canceled, where I've got my own spot. I feel really no consequences beyond people saying mean things about me. So I don't actually have a good awareness of what the risks are for people in other realms where they're more dependent on other people. I'm sure I could experience some ostracism. I'm not sure if maybe some people decided not to do this podcast because of associations. Maybe if I have your friend Dick Hanania on here, I'll experience that. We will see. I mean, his whole theory is basically that this stuff is downstream of the law, which is interesting. And so we might even be going about it the wrong way by trying to have this cultural interpretation, because maybe the marching orders for all of it comes down through regulators and legal precedent. So that's neither here nor there. We got to talk Sopranos because you're busy. You've got a book tour that's wait a second, you're not busy at all. You don't have any book tour that you can go on. No.
Well, I will say, I mean, this is maybe, this is important. I think that people who are creators, podcasters and writers and artists and so on, to just have your own platform, your own audience, whether it's a newsletter or Substack or basically being able to own it yourself, because one benefit that I experienced through writing that post and just putting it out into the world to my readers is, now I'm having invitations to, not from bookstores. They did say, like, bookstore would be great, but other venues I'm more than, open to. And so people are welcoming me to do events at comedy clubs or think tanks or secret societies or, offices of some venture capital
secret
fund.
Societies.
And, so it's like, basically a bunch of people came out of the woodwork. Someone at Princeton contacted me, and we're working out details to speak at the university there. So, it's there are pockets of people, pockets of sanity everywhere, and people are, coming through for me. So I'm really grateful to my readers for that. But cancel from the bookstores. That still exists.
Yeah. Well, it happens to the best of us. I was canceled by COVID. My book came out in mid-April of 2020. So I too did not get to go on a bookstore tour, but you can still turn a profit, as I did. So I think you are going to be in fine shape. The book is troubled. It's incredible. I want to talk some Sopranos just for fun.
Let's go.
I always, it's the show that I keep coming back to. And it's got this odd property of somehow almost becoming more relevant as time goes forward versus other shows that got a lot of acclaim and maybe are rewarding to revisit, but don't seem as pertinent. Some might contest when I say that about The Wire, but I don't think The Wire ages as well as The Sopranos. I just don't think it does. For instance, Matt Feeney, a fantastic writer based in Oakland. I just met him, and he told me he was doing this article, wrote a piece called The Sopranos is a Freudian Comedy, and I sent it to you, and you sent me the British writer Ed West wrote an overview about The Sopranos and how aspects of the left had gotten really into The Sopranos of late, and that was covered in the New York Times. And he was talking about why aspects of the right, like The Sopranos, it's called The Best Is Over. I'm trying to find a good way to intro this whole conversation. I guess I'll just start with, what did you think of Feeney's article?
Overall, it was fascinating, held my attention, and The Sopranos just rewards endless rewatching. I must have rewatched it by now 3 or 4 times, in full, but I've caught, stray episodes here and there throughout the last, 12 or 13 years. And I think that there are a couple of things that I found interesting. One was that, he highlighted the scene, I don't remember the specific terminology, but he highlighted the scene between Carmela and Dr. Krakauer, and how, this scene is often viewed as sort of the defining scene in the show, about how Dr. Krakauer tells Carmela, that you can never say you weren't told. And he tells her that you're married to a criminal and a monster. And what are you need to take your children, what's left of them, and go. And he's speaking to the audience that you are all enamored with this murderous criminal, and he's charismatic and he's interesting, and you can't help but follow him, even when you're repulsed by him, you still find him fascinating. And so that was interesting. But then he also goes on within that article to basically say that Tony himself was not really a true sociopath, that Tony actually did have some goodness within him. Otherwise the show wouldn't make sense. The show wouldn't make, and his relationship with his kids wouldn't make sense. An actual sociopath or psychopath wouldn't be able to have a loving relationship and care about the future of his kids and how they view him. And he attempted to live a normal bourgeois life, and a psychopath would not necessarily have those concerns. So I think that's right, that's the most important scene. And I'm also curious what you think about why it was, or first, if you think it was a conscious decision to have on the part of David Chase, that the reason why Carmela saw Dr. Krakauer is because she was referred to him by Dr. Melfi, Tony's shrink, and and Krakauer is Melfi's mentor. So, presumably Melfi has some understanding of how her mentor thinks about things and what he might say to the wife of this mobster who she's treating. Why would she send Tony's wife to this person who, did she know that he would say this to her? What was her motive there? I don't know. Maybe we could start there, on that scene. What did you think?
Yeah, it is the scene that breaks through the fourth wall without actually breaking through the fourth wall. You would say it's an indictment of the audience, but I don't think that would be fair to the audience. I mean, when you're watching entertainment, you're watching people who are sometimes bad people. I think the harsh judgment of who he is, I don't know if that's the show's take on him, but it seems to be something that's undervoiced in the show. Just somebody really taking a 30,000 foot view and going, this is what he does. This is what he is. This is what you're a part of, and rubbing your nose in it. And I think it's interesting too that it's a scene that happens in therapy. In time, I've started to think more and more about therapy's centrality in the show, and how the show might have a very negative take on therapy that is at once at odds with a lot of the modern conventional, the zeitgeist of go to therapy, men need to go to therapy, but also with all of that push comes a lot of therapy skepticism and these questions of, well, why aren't we getting better when we're doing all this therapy? And I think the show's position is that therapy, the way some people use it, broken people use it, as a way to launder their flaws and rationalize their flaws, as opposed to actually getting better. I think, there are probably people that therapists see that are eager to improve and take the suggestions seriously, and they don't waste the therapist's time. And then there are these other people who I think just suck the energy and attention out of the therapist in exchange for money. And Tony would be one of these people. And I think that commentary on therapy and therapy culture from a therapist, a very moral therapist, I think there was just so much to that scene. And it was not just an indictment of the character and not just an indictment of our interest, but an indictment of therapy culture as this kind of excuse to wallow in our narcissism and our rationalizations and excuse making for the bad things we do to people. And that's why it has a strong argument as the best scene in the show, which is not true. The best scene in the show is Chris Moltisanti's intervention, because it's the funniest funniest scene in the history of television. But that's my take.
Yeah, I think that sounds right to me. I mean, the show's position on therapy. I mean, I wrote this post a couple of years ago. I rewatched, all the Sopranos during the lockdown, and I've written, I think, a couple of different posts on this on my Substack, and one for Unheard. And this piece I wrote for Unheard, I made this claim that the reason why Tony doesn't get better and he actually gets worse throughout the show, he becomes more and more monstrous and morally compromised. Like, he actually seems, he's recognizably human in season 1. And by season 6B, this, the second half of season 6, he is just like totally far gone. The way he treats Carmela, the way that he interacts with people. I mean, he has become he physically larger, more selfish, more preoccupied with his own interests. And then he murders his own nephew. And then sort of rationalizes it to himself, why he feels no guilt over it. And he actually gets upset at other people for, he thinks that they're performing their sadness and their grief. He's perplexed by it. And so the reason is, with his interactions with Melfi, they never actually address what is causing his panic attacks, his depression. It's his criminal lifestyle. And he uses his sessions with Melfi as an avenue to subdue the symptoms of anxiety and depression and his, these mental afflictions. But he never actually addresses what's causing them or what's underlying them, which are his actions, his behaviors. He never changes. He actually indulges them even more and uses the feedback he receives from Melfi as a way to basically be a more effective mob boss about how to interact with his subordinates and how to, better deceive his family. And,
I hate to interject, but I can almost find this analogy between Tony and these aspects of the modern college educated culture that we don't like, where it's almost like they just keep gaining more and more tools to obscure the truth from themselves and to close themselves off from it. And that by teaching them these things, you almost are taking somebody who has a fundamental problem and just making them more powerful at self-denial. They learn these rhetorical tricks and tactics when asked to actually prove something. I don't have to educate you, or, oh, what you said to me, that's a dog whistle. Or they just learn terminology to sort of protect their sense of self and what they want to do. Am I too far out there in finding a strain of comparison of somebody who has a fundamental core problem, doesn't want the truth bad enough, doesn't want to improve bad enough, and ultimately just learns ways to further insulate themselves and keep on doing what they at core have an attraction to doing?
That is really interesting. So the idea being that these young people go to university and they end up just being equipped with ways to actually blind themselves to realities or to obscure what's really causing difficulties in their lives, or what's plaguing the country, these various social ills. There is probably something to that. I mean, the people are very good at self-deception. And if you give them the tools and you sort of give it the trappings of expertise and prestige, and it's coming from an authority figure, whether from Dr. Melfi or your college professors, or some respected columnist at a media outlet, and they're telling you these things, and it sounds very impressive, and it gives you justification and rationalization to continue behaving the way you are, or behave even worse because you have the proper reasons and justifications for it. There is, and I wonder, maybe, I mean, Tony is, he's one of the most, maybe arguably the most compelling protagonist in the history of television. And I think people can connect with that he constantly strives, at least he claims to want to strive to be a better person. And instead he keeps slipping further and further into the darkness. And I think people can relate to that. And they on some level, that Tony is like, they can see themselves in him. He's not likable, but he is relatable in that sense.
Yeah, I think there's something to the idea of tools in the wrong hands just exacerbating a problem versus ameliorating the problem. And I have not gone to therapy, so I might be speaking out of ignorance. What's your take on therapy, to take this in a weird direction? It's been suggested to me. This might surprise some of the people listening, but I regard myself as mostly psychologically healthy, and I just don't want to do it. And I think there's this sort of cultural modern man pressure that to break that down. If you say, I don't really want to do it, I feel as though I'm this weird contraption right now that seems to be working well enough, and I have a sense that I'll be like Wile E. Coyote, looking down at the ground and falling if I start to analyze myself too much. Anthony Mays just said in the comments that I have a podcast and I'm in therapy. Yes, there you go. That's my therapy.
Rather podcast than go to therapy.
I would literally rather podcast than go to therapy.
I mean, that's I get. Yeah, I think if you're healthy and you're not having any difficulties, there's no reason to go. It's not like this, this panacea for every single person. I think the whole. I think to some degree it's a status symbol too. It used to be like in the mid 20th century, like the height of the Freudian era. It was sort of upper middle class housewives who, it was my analyst. My analyst, Betty Draper, going to therapy. It was like this, this sort of bourgeois thing that well-to-do, mostly women would talk about. And then sort of, I think, but by the time The Sopranos came out, Tony Soprano really, I think, helped to mainstream therapy for men. And then now with the sort of self-help movement and the online movement, it does seem like more and more guys I know who, at least, on the surface, they seem well-adjusted enough. I mean, I had some experience with it. I did, I was ordered to go to a shrink when I was a kid. This was ordered by, social workers in the state of California, basically, because basically any kid who has had X number of foster homes and so much, disorder in the early life, you get ordered to go. And so I saw a shrink, and I don't know how helpful it was. It probably wasn't unhelpful. I mostly just went because it got me out of class earlier. And then later, I went through a stint at a treatment center for alcohol dependency. And I mean, at that point, it was probably helpful for me because I think generally a lot of the reason why people go to therapy is just as you said, like they want to deceive themselves. They want to launder their own flaws. I think that was well put. But then if you're already making good choices in your life and things do seem to be going well, and yet you still experience anxiety or depression or aimlessness or indulging too much in alcohol or drugs or other sort of mind altering substances, even though things apparently seem to be going well in your life, then that I think that would suggest that maybe it's time to speak to someone and try to understand what's going on. But if you don't have those difficulties, if you're making good choices and you still feel fine and buoyant and healthy, then I don't think there's any reason to go. I think generally, yeah. I mean, once you before you go to therapy, I think it's worth just sort of checking in with yourself. Like, are you, how are your finances? How's your job? How are your relationships? How are things going around you? And if everything is good, checking the box, everything's fine, then I don't think there's any reason to go. It is an expensive and time consuming venture. And so I think it probably is helpful for a lot of people, but I also think, people use it as replacement for friendship or for intimacy or as a way to talk about themselves. It's nice to have someone, one of so I studied and I got a PhD in psychology. Most psychologists don't actually practice. They have nothing to do with clinical treatment or anything. And I have no license, no clinical experience whatsoever, but I have spoken with clinical psychologists. And one of their cardinal rules is you never talk about yourself. It's always about the client. And I think that if you're paying, $100+ an hour, I think for a lot of people, it's nice to speak to someone and it's all about you and the other person isn't trying to make it about them. And our sort of growing atomization and sort of alienation and loneliness and lack of friends, lack of marriage, relationship partners. It's kind of sad that, in a weird way, like the capitalist system has found a way to, reach into people's pockets and say, hey, here's someone you can speak to. Here's a friend you can have, friend in air quotes. And I think a lot of people are using therapy for that.
It like the salary man can go to a cafe in Japan and have a young woman be nice to him and smile at him in lieu of fulfilling relationship. No, I don't know if I would quite make that comparison. It does occur to me though that this office that I am in right now, I'm surrounded by therapists' offices. When I moved in here, the person next door actually asked me if I too was a therapist, because I guess this is just what people do in this office space. So I feel as though maybe it's almost like one of the final scenes of a movie like Fight Club, and I've been in therapy the whole time, and that's what's going on. And I don't know, but let's do a little bit more of a macro thing with The Sopranos, because the Ed West article you sent me, brilliant. The Sopranos inspires the best writing. It really does. And this Ed West piece called the Best Is Over, it covers a lot of ground, but this insight right here, Rob, I thought was such a great one on this idea that The Sopranos is about American decline, which is one of the reasons why people on both sides of the political spectrum can appreciate it. The lefties like that it hates America, and the righties like that it thinks America used to be way better. It's got both those things. It's got both those things going. Ed West says the mafia are parasites, and like all parasites, have an interest in their host's good health. It is a theme running through gangster films that the mafiosi love the United States, most famously uttered in the opening line of The Godfather, I believe in America. And he also says about Tony, his organization is violent and antisocial, but the revolutionary cultural changes he rants about, including the triumph of therapy, are more destructive still. And perhaps only a parasite can understand that the host is rotting within. What do you think of, why did you like the Ed West piece so much that that you sent it to me?
Well, I mean, one reason was just because we were having this conversation about The Sopranos, and it was on my radar, and it was an interesting one. It was really that excerpt that you just read that jumped out at me, that Tony may have had a unique, obviously he's a character, but the character of Tony Soprano may have had a unique interpretation of American decline, that he relies on, basically a booming economy and a high trust society in order for him to sort of infiltrate that and to exploit people's goodwill and, people's pocketbooks. And you see, this was, that was a theme throughout The Sopranos too, is the sort of decline of America and the decline of the mob itself. I mean, rewatching it, I was just kind of surprised at how small the scores that Tony and his guys made. I mean, if you compare it to, Goodfellas or The Godfather, which, I mean, and it's a sort of a meta show too, right? Because it constantly references those movies, but it's nothing like that. It's not glamorous. It's not exciting. And I guess in a way, watching it at least at first, it was like, okay, so this is the story about the decline of the mafia, but one possibility for why the mafia is declining is because of this decline of the U.S. overall, and it's a sort of a reflection or a mirror image of it. I mean, is it in that Ed West piece? Did they talk about the coffee shop? Did they talk about that? About
that's another famous scene. They can't extort the coffee shop, and that's its own ironic indication of decline. What has happened? There's the other coffee shop. It's over for the little guy. That's that other coffee shop scene where they're trying to extort a Starbucks-esque coffee shop, but they can't do it because every little bean is counted. Which, to my mind, does not look like decline, but it's funny that they interpret themselves as these small businessmen up against a larger force.
The other interesting thing I thought about when I was reading that Ed West piece was how Tony himself, he laments the direction of society and the direction of his organization, and he, valorizes the old ways. He valorizes the days of his father and when Junior was young, and the guys who came before him, and how, things are, no one has respect for the organization anymore, and things are declining. But then Tony himself, I mean, in a way, like, Tony is like, to me, he almost seemed like this, like, archetypal boomer, because he's lamenting all of these things, and he received all of these values from his family and from his parents, or his father at least. But then he doesn't carry them forward. He doesn't inculcate them really into his own children. And then with the way that he runs his own business, I mean, obviously this is, like, today especially, it's very sort of morally transgressive. I think people see problematic, but the way that he handled the veto scene, right? So Tony's all about Tony. Tony's a progressive, right? Like, so Tony's all about, the old ways and sticking to the book and the way that his father used to do things. And yet, Vito was a good earner, and, Tony had his own kind of personal conflicts with Phil Leotardo. But in the end, he ended up giving Vito up, but he was reluctant to stick to, the bylines of the books. And there were other instances of this too. But Tony was on the one hand pining for the past, but he wasn't necessarily willing to sort of uphold, the rules of the past, and the way that he treated his own children and his family and so on. And this is, like, I think, very similar to sort of the American boomer overall, is that they were raised by the last generation from before the sexual revolution of the 1960s, and they received a lot of those values. And the boomers were really the last generation to, like, get married and follow that traditional life script. And now millennial, I guess Gen Z, I mean, they always get sort of glossed over in these conversations, but millennials and adult Gen Z, I mean, marriage is, like, openly questioned or flouted.
Well, to distill it, it's, Tony keeps asking, hey, what happened to Gary Cooper, the strong silent type? And it's just, well, why don't you act like Gary Cooper? You're the adult now. You're the one who could act like that plausibly, but you don't. And so it's this funny, where did this guy go? And, well, you never ended up embodying him. And I think with the veto thing, you see this sort of natural tension in a society or in a culture, because Tony's question is very logical, is separated from the morality and the brutality, which is, this guy's a great earner and I've got to kill him because he's gay. I mean, this just doesn't like, why do I have to do that? And this is what ends up breaking down order in a way, not that we can't kill gay people. That's not what I'm saying. Don't exert that. But that there are things that don't make sense about traditions. And eventually we question and we go, hey, this doesn't make sense. We have to change this, or this is something silly from the past and now we know better. But then it becomes very hard to keep the whole thing from unraveling once you deprive it of its mystique, in the sense that you just have to follow all the rules because they're sacred. Yeah.
Or at least pay homage to them, or if you're going to break the rules, to, do your best to conceal it, which in itself is a way of sort of paying tribute to the rules. And then I also, so on the back to the Feeney article, one scene that I was surprised he didn't mention, because to me, I would say that this, if the Krakauer scene is the most important scene, this might be the second most, because it's related. It's related to what Feeney said about Tony actually not being an actual sociopath. And this is something that I go back and forth on too, about Tony's character, which is the scene with Tony and AJ. So right after AJ attempts to kill Junior in the old folks' home, remember, he has the knife and he drops it and he runs out, and then Tony has to bail him out. And Tony basically tells him, like, it's wrong. Like, murder is wrong and you're a good guy and I'm grateful for that. Which is, a shocking admission from Tony, that because what he's saying, it basically contradicts the way he lives his entire life. And, I've read these interviews with David Chase that, people call The Sopranos this kind of pessimistic, cynical show, but there were some bright spots in it. And one was that, Tony's kids didn't turn out to be like him. And, they did turn out to be kind of these selfish, there's a similarity, there's a resemblance there. But I did think it was fascinating that Tony really tried hard not to ensure that AJ would not follow in his footsteps and become the kind of man that he is.
Yeah. He just becomes the kind of man that we actually have even less respect for, which draw whatever conclusions.
You're talking about AJ.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Benefiting from nepotism, being sort of emotionally and physically frail and
whiny. We'd rather you kill people than whine. That's that's where we're at. Well, you are not whining, despite being pre-canceled, which I'm trying to coin as a term. You've been pre-canceled. You're not whining. You're not a victim. You're going to pull through this and sell a ton of books, as you should. It is a staggering memoir, people. You should read it. It's incredible. Is there anything else, Rob, that you want to plug for us on the way out, other than Troubled?
No. The book's available on Audible. I know more and more people prefer to consume their books that way. And so I read the book myself. So it's available on Audible and wherever fine books are sold. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Rob K. Henderson, and Substack too. So yeah, man, this has been great. Thanks, Ethan.
Oh, yeah. I love that you did your own stunts. That's what we're all about here. Love that you narrated the book. It adds a little something. This was great. As always, Rob, good luck with everything, and thanks.
Thank you.